I chose that as a title because I wanted to emphasize how seriously they treat you for violation of any of their rules. You aren't just not walking close enough to God or whatever phrase you might want to use. You are a traitor to the faith entirely.
It's Angela from The Angela Rose Show, where we unveil stories of religious abuse. Today we have a guest who traveled all the way from Colorado, and I'm super excited to introduce her with you guys. She is an author of the book JUDAS GIRL, My Father, Four Cults, and How I Escaped Them All. And when I met Michelle online, just seeing her book cover just recently, and I was like, oh my goodness, now I have to buy that book. I need to read it. And so we instantly connected. It's just, a very wow, I wonder what this story is. And the word cult really caught my attention. Just coming from a religious cult myself, I was like, I'm really curious about this book. So Michelle and I connected. The author of this book is Michelle Stewart, and she's with us today. I'm excited to introduce her with you all. So Michelle, good to meet you. And yeah, I'm super excited to dive into your story today.
Oh yeah, good to meet you, and thank you so much for having me on. Thank you so much for hosting the book on your show. You know, the book's really been a huge labor of love and a story to, not just about myself, but a story to everybody who's gone through similar things.
Yeah.
And, it's my sort of personal passion and mission to help reach out and connect to other people who may have grown up in extreme religious backgrounds,
Right.
and kind of share my story of both the experiences, but of, the healing and the journey out. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity to come on and share that with more people.
Wow. And it's been so validating to me because I'm still in recovery, just navigating the complexities of the impact of religious abuse. And when I read it, I was like, wow, I just feel so understood. And I feel like you did an incredible job of describing your experiences in a way that actually just really sheds light on how controlling religious systems work. So I'm excited to dive into that today as well, and I think that's just really going to pave a pathway for others as they're seeking to understand their own stories, recovering from high control religious environments. I had a question first before we're going to dive into Michelle's story here. It's incredible, but I did want to ask you first before we start with some of your family of origin. Why did you use the word cults? What do you have to say about that word?
I love that question. It's in some of these groups of, I guess, survivors, right? There's sort of the C word, and do you use it or not, right?
Oh, it's a bit, it's kind of a scary word to people, kind of like, ooh.
It is. It is.
Yep.
It's and first and foremost, I didn't use it, to sensationalize, right? It wasn't a grab. It is. I think a lot of times we like to soften the language around religious groups sort of as, I don't know whether it's cultural expectation or maybe normalizing things that shouldn't be normalized. And for me, I found it really necessary to call things what they were, right? You have cults and you think about maybe Jonestown or Heaven's Gate or some of these really extreme cults,
Right.
where there were, say, mass suicides or, really horrible violence. But it shouldn't get to that point before we see these things for what they are.
I seen your post last week on Facebook around that, and I was like, I have to ask you about that because the way you described that was just really helpful for me to even process,
Yeah. And to me, there's sort of this, there really isn't an expert definition of cult, right? You can try to research it. You can try to talk to different academics, and everybody will tell you something slightly different. And there's similarities, a lot of control and coercion and mental manipulation. But there isn't a crystal clear definition. But what for me really has jumped out is what survivors tell about their experience. And whether your experience is with a 5-year-old cult trying to jump on a comet or it's with a religion that people have understood for hundreds of years, if that group is controlling all of your outside information, if they are extremely authoritarian, and trying to dictate every moment of your life, if they are in your head telling you that if you disobey, you're going to hell, you're damned, if you leave, if they're ostracizing you, those are the outcomes of being in a cult, right? That is the impact that it has on you. And if you experience that, you experience that cult mentality, and that was what you had to survive. And I think that saying, well, just because they wear a cute little white cap, that's their culture, it can't be a cult.
Right.
I think that's an unfair, giving them too much leeway, right? I think it was time to finally say,
Yes.
hey, some of this is how these groups are functioning.
Yes.
These people have no more freedom than in these sort of headline-making cults that you see.
Right.
And it's time for people to realize that.
And I really, really respected that, like, even just in the descriptions through your book, I noticed pretty quickly, like, within the writing of your story, like, wow, she just calls it what it is. And coming from, I think, my own experiences of where we just kind of beat around the bush, and I come from the Mennonite culture where, again, very high control and just a lack of the real truth and honesty. And I find that really refreshing to be around folks who are naming it what it really was. And that stood out to me. I was like, wow, Michelle is simply calling it what it was. And I just really respect that. It validated a lot of my experiences reading your story. So your family origin, let's talk. Tell me about your family.
So yeah, my family. So I was not actually born in these lifestyles, right?
Right.
Born in a more conventional, secular household. Pretty. My parents were very, from the time of my birth, very, I would say, more fundamentalist Christian, but not out of the mainstream. They both grew up in Southern California. My grandparents either moved there or grew up there themselves. My parents, both went to a public school, had various nominal amounts of religion in their life. So they were not people that you would necessarily expect to end up on the journey they ended up on. Although I think one thing that's important to note for me is that there's I think a misconception in the outside world, especially looking at the kind of groups I grew up in, that these groups are only people who are born in them and raised in them. It's another culture, it's an insular culture. I can look at it from the outside and leave them alone. They don't think, oh, my sister, my mother, my daughter could join one of these groups, So it's important to me when I talk about my family of origin to emphasize almost the normalcy, which is not really a word, but how quote unquote normal they were in normal secular society, and how they just completely went way into these extreme groups, and went on a path that nobody would have ever expected, but it happens.
Yeah.
And it can happen with anybody.
And I think that's why your story is so important to be heard, because there is so many misunderstandings around these cultures. So your family background was not from any type of cult that you ended up in,
None. I mean, we ended up in these Anabaptist cults. My grandfathers are both war veterans. They're so very
fascinating,
very
too.
different, right? Yeah. From where you would expect it to go. So
yeah. So the first experience, what would you say was the where did this start? Entering into cult one start?
Yeah, I think, and again, I was really young, so, I put together the memories the best I could, and then, I've heard family stories, extended family, kind of backing up memories I had.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it started with my dad, and part of the book, and we'll probably talk about it more later, it's also a story about mental illness, right?
Yes.
Extreme mental illness.
Yes.
Which my dad suffered from quite a bit. But I think it started manifesting earlier than people understood it did.
Right.
He had a lot of paranoia and a major persecution complex, I guess would be a non-professional way to explain it.
Right.
He couldn't hold down a job, was one of his biggest issues. And he decided to join the military, which for our family histories was a reasonable thing to do. And he washed out. He had a few mental issues, and they deemed him unfit to continue service. And at that point, I think he decided, rather than, and again, this is my interpreting his behavior, he's not here to talk for himself, but instead of potentially looking inward at himself he decided it was an attack and that, well, God didn't want him in the military. The military must be evil. If it didn't work for him, then it must be evil.
Right.
So what other Christians believe that the military is evil? And they're Quakers, but they're Anabaptists, right? Your Amish, your Mennonites, brethren, this whole journey that we went through. And then he also started at that same time, being unable to hold a job, wanted to find a group of Christians that would support him financially, maybe. So you look at that intersection, and most people probably haven't heard of Hutterites, but that was the intersection that he found of people who were against military from a faith perspective, but lived in a high communal structure where you were provided for, based on need as opposed to contribution, or that was his interpretation. Right. And he found a group of them that were open to outsiders. So most Hutterites, from my understanding, are more insular. It's not super common in my experience or the stories I've heard for people to join Hutterite communities from the outside, especially here in the U.S. They're more prevalent in Canada. Yep. But there were a few communities that were open to it, and he happened to find one of those. And it was a incredibly dramatic, huge leap to go from a little house in the suburbs, to and I write about it in the book, just how incredibly foreign it was to suddenly living in a full-on commune with people they have very distinctive clothing, possibly more distinctive even than the Amish, which I know people are familiar with, and just completely jumped into that, like thinking, and as I begin to learn, wasn't his first time thinking that some dramatic leap would solve all of his problems. But as a child, that was sort of my first real big experience with that. From his behavior.
How old were you when you joined the Hutterite community then?
I was 7.5 or 8.
Okay. Yeah.
So still really young. So young enough that I adapted easily, but also old enough for it to be incredibly foreign.
That's a big adjustment. I remember reading about that in the book, especially like you and your mom just adjusting to some of just the ways the women did things in the Hutterite community. It just kind of was gripping my heart as I was reading that, because I can only imagine, I grew up within these communities, and so like hearing your perspective just kind of being pulled in, I was like, oh my gosh, that would be hard. Yeah, coming from the outside in. So let's talk about that a little bit. Like, what would you say, like within the Hutterite community experience, what was some of the top things that you can remember that were just the most maybe top points?
So there's an aspect of it for me as a little kid that was, sort of fun, new friends, new places to play. They weren't really, the younger children were oddly allowed to run freer than you would have expected.
I noticed that.
Which was really interesting. And when you're 8, that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But what jumped out at me really quickly, part of it through my own observation, and then part of it, through my mom talking about it then, and then retelling those stories, was the real difference between male and female gender roles. And I mean, that's socially, those still exist. My parents, like I said, were pretty, much more fundamentalist Christian beforehand. So I was raised in that concept of you still have a wife as obedient to the husband, but it was nothing like what I saw in that culture. So they were very much, it wasn't just, wives submit to your husbands. It was women were definitely a weaker subclass of human. And there was women's work, which was in no way equal to men's work. And that kind of thing was made very clear. Even as a young child, it jumped out at me.
What was the examples of that?
So like one of the examples I give in the book was a story of, they had communal kitchens, right? Everybody ate almost every meal together in these communities. And one of the boys came in while the women were, they were canning pickles, I think, and spilled milk. And, my mom hands him a rag and like, wipe it up, you spilled milk, and he was like, well, this is women's work. He's a child talking to grown women. And she was, really upset by this, but the women all backed him up, no, women clean up after the men, and not just in little ways. I would see it constantly. The boys would come in, and I'm talking about teenage young boys, telling women, oh, I was doing man's work all day. I need a snack. I need this. I need that. You take care of me. And it wasn't just like the women truly felt like it was their responsibility to do that. And I heard it was told to me, it was talked about, my mom, that, hey, this is men's work is automatically harder. They're they're outside running around in a bobcat all day, but their work is harder and superior. And our job is to be servants. They eat first and you shut up, but you clean up after them.
I noticed that within the Hutterite community when I was reading that, I think that's the thing that stood out to me that kind of gripped my heart is that example in that story you shared where it's almost like these young boys were entitled already at a very early age. They were entitled to walk in and demand of the female. This is just the expectation, and it was part of their programming since baby up.
Yeah, and that's the perfect word is entitled. As we talk about it more, not just entitled to their service, but as it came, sort of unfolds throughout the book,
right.
This sense of entitlement, this is where I first encountered it, but it carried out through a lot of other groups. And it goes into this entitlement of even women's bodies, right? In varying degrees.
Yeah.
But from boyhood up, just the concept that because you were born with certain anatomy, you are automatically superior to every woman, no matter what, right?
Wow. Yeah.
And that was my first encounter with it.
Yeah.
And even that young, I remember how shocking it was. Of course, as time went on, I started to absorb it, and became normal to me. But it was still at 7, 8 years old, such a startling contrast.
Yeah.
To how I had been raised.
Right. So what would have took place then within the Hutterite community that was like, okay, we're done in the Hutterite community. It's not working. Where did that change?
And so I think it's, again, my dad's challenges, mental health challenges started to come into play. And I think, I don't know all the conversations that happened behind closed doors, but from what I pieced together, it wasn't solving all of his problems in whatever fantastical way he thought they would. I think he was, they did work very, very hard there. And I don't think that was something he really had thought through.
Okay.
You get everything you need, but you are expected to contribute all day, every day.
Yeah.
And I think there started being some friction. I think they were also having some legitimate, somewhat culture challenges. The Hutterites come from, a more German background. English isn't the primary language spoken in those communities.
Really? So what's the language? I didn't know that.
It is kind of like you have Dutch, Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yeah,
they have their own dialect.
Okay.
And it's a little bit mixed with Russian. Just a little bit, a few, Russian-based words. So it's a completely different language. Both of my parents spoke High German fluently and couldn't understand, or maybe not fluently, but spoke it, could not,
really
switch dialects. As a child, started to pick it up pretty quickly, but
yeah, I guess you would.
So there was just that issue too, and so they found at that point in time, the Hutterites had started working with a group they're called the Bruderhof, or the Society of Brothers, which was sort of a very, very similar communal concept.
Okay.
Of newer Anabaptist origin. They didn't actually start out as Anabaptists, but started rebranding themselves as Anabaptists after, I believe it was World War I. But they were, although they were also German in origin, they were primarily English speakers. They had much bigger communities, and they were much, much more structured. So whereas the Hutterites were very sort of farm-based, and the young kids kind of ran around, the Bruderhofs were extremely, extremely structured environment. Everybody was assigned jobs. Everybody had an assignment and a place to be every hour of every day.
Are you serious?
Even the children.
And I was thinking Hutterites is structured, and now you're like, that was loose. Okay.
Yeah, the Bruderhof was so much more organized. I don't know if that's
So that's where you went next, is the Bruderhofs.
Yeah, so we went there pretty quickly, at least from my young perspective, which started to become the pattern, in my parents' lives, is sudden entire changes of lifestyle overnight.
It's a lot to navigate.
So jumped over there. I think if I recall, I had maybe 2 or 3 days warning, right? So I've been spending all of these months getting taught that I'm a Hutterite now, trying to learn their language, becoming friends, finally picking it up and getting comfortable. And then it's suddenly like, now we're moving this was Minnesota, now we're moving to Pennsylvania to a Bruderhof. So
it was a full state move.
Yeah, multi-state move. Yeah, and within a week I went from knowing one life to knowing, here's a whole different life. And they were probably, of all the groups I was in, the most controlling, because they regulate everything. You had to, if you want clothes, you have to go get them, and your clothing is even assigned to you. You can't.
This scares me.
Even in like the more, the community I spent the biggest time in, more of an Amish Mennonite rooted, if you wanted a new dress, you got fabric and you made yourself a dress.
Right.
Right. No, you didn't hear. You were allowed to have a certain number of garments, and when you needed one, you went and they gave it to you. You didn't, get to go choose the fabric. You were assigned your clothes. You were assigned your shoes. You were assigned exactly where you lived. You were assigned any jobs you did. And both men and women there, interestingly, and this is very different from most of the Anabaptist groups, is women didn't stay home. They weren't always involved in communal income generating revenue, although they were. But you got your kids off to school or their baby house or their daycare, and then you went to your assigned task, whether it was working in the laundry or working in the toy shop that they had, whatever it was. They actually left the home, which is a really big difference.
So the Bruderhof community versus Hutterite. I know the Hutterites, like, everyone's within the physical, like, kitchen together. Is that how it was in the Bruderhofs too?
It was. You were all
Describe
there.
how the community was set up as a.
So they're
in short.
They're usually and you can look more up online, but generally it's all on one piece of property. They have multiple communities all over the world, actually.
Wow.
And they have since separated from the Hutterites. So anybody researching them now, they've taken a bit of a different turn from where they were in my experience. So I'm talking about, when I was young, what they were like.
Right. Sure.
Excuse me. But it was all on one piece of property. So they had different enterprises that they used to earn income, but that was on the property. But the kitchen, again, everybody ate together. Everything was done together. So if especially the women would have been more heavily assigned to the kitchen, but you may have been assigned to cooking in the morning and in the afternoon. You may have been assigned to the laundries where you spent all afternoon doing laundry. You didn't do your own laundry there even. Like you
everything was together.
Everything was together.
Everybody's doing everything together. There's no individuality.
No, you would get up and you would usually eat breakfast on your own in a studio apartment. And then there was no individuality beyond that. I mean,
wow.
Maybe how much salt you put on your eggs was your level, of individuality.
No kidding.
But choosing to eat eggs probably wasn't even the choice. You ate what was served.
So I want to take a quick second to encourage you guys to like, share, and comment here on our YouTube channel. It helps to push our channel out to reach more people, which is our goal for this show. Thank you so much. So you're saying within this community, the women wouldn't have been considered careers, but they did have the day job.
They did.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Now, of course, that day job sounded like homemaking.
A lot of it was. And I do, from what I recall, there were, women sometimes did work in some of the income generating areas, but a lot of it was very heavily in the teaching, in the child care. You didn't take care of your own children. You gave them to another woman who took care of all,
wow.
would take care of all the 1-year-olds or the 2-year-olds. So a lot of it was still, a lot of it was assigned out. But it was a lot of it, from what I recall, was very much still, homemaking. It was just totally divided out and assigned rather than your own home.
So what did that feel like going from Hutterite to Bruderhof? If you say that was a whole new level of control, like, did you miss the Hutterites when you were in the Bruderhof community?
As a child, I did at first. I will say that being a young child in the Bruderhof, it was a lot of fun until confusing things started to happen.
Right.
They were very interested in ensuring that the children were always involved in at least what they would have labeled enriching activities. But it really started to get weird when, like, one of my friends, like, disappeared, and I'm like, why is he not here? Why is he not at school anymore? What happened? And, like, nobody wanted to tell me. And then, to talk about how controlling this group was. What had happened, to the best of my recollection, that I talk about in the book, is like, it was ice skating season and you got assigned ice skates. But he and some of his friends had gone and picked their own. Because he chose his own ice skates, his whole family got put in an off corner of the community where they weren't allowed to be involved with anybody, because the audacity to express your choice like that was so toxic. Like, it was eliminated down
right away.
Down to the child level was where they were stripping away your individuality, to where an 8-year-old wanting to get their favorite pair of skates, which most of us would think nothing of.
We don't even think about a skate.
Was yeah, and it was like several months that we weren't allowed to even interact with this child. And
so shaming, rejection,
yeah.
So the part of the domination and mind control, what would you see was a part of that cycle then? Like they didn't do as was expected, and then they were punished until when?
I guess until the community, deemed that they had worked through their challenges enough. It was different from, say, and we'll probably get there a little more, like shunning or the ban, like in people who are familiar with Amish or maybe Mennonite. They apply it differently in those groups too, but it's different from that because it applied to children and non-members. But the interesting thing was, I guess, the way they almost candy coated it is the phrasing they would use is, well, this family needs time to focus on their child's behavior issues. We're going to let them go away as a family unit and focus on this child. So the wording of that sounds so soft and respectful. Again, while I use the cult word, people word things in a way that sound good, but it's time to call it out. But what it really was you are ostracized unless you conform completely, including your little elementary school children. And as children, when we were made aware of this, that our friend was no longer allowed to be in all these fun, enriching activities we were in all day because they made one small personal choice, no matter how you word it, the message is you disobey in any way and you lose everything.
Do you feel like that sometimes those punishments were basically part of keeping everyone else controlled because you guys had to suffer witnessing the loss of your friendship?
Oh, completely. I mean, and
that's
I think
impactful.
I think that's the main thing is when you are, so, I was just talking about how every part of your life was scheduled and organized and planned.
Wow.
But then somebody can take that all away from you like that.
Yeah.
So everything, not just, your autonomy, everything about your life, somebody else controls and can pull away in an instant if they deem any of your behaviors to be out of line.
Yeah.
And again, we're talking about an 8-year-old choosing a pair of ice skates here. This is not some egregious sin, right? It's that level of detail.
Yes. Incredibly.
So the high control, but the thing that stood out and it even grew sort of in magnitude to me as I remembered and researched more about them later is I think it was the first time where I started, even as a child, to recognize the difference between this candy-coated language and the reality.
Yes, and that's right? That just really, really brings us back to what we talked about in the very beginning, where I said, I feel like we were always beating around the bush. And I respected how, like, in your work, you've just been really telling the story for what it was.
Yeah.
And that is so refreshing to people who come from the confusion and betrayal of being told something in such a sugar-coated way when in reality the experience is there was no sugar there. Yeah. The very opposite, like traumatizing, but it's like what people see is so different and you can feel very invisible in that experience, which is fascinating. Very fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Bruderhof, what would you say would have been, is there anything specific that within that community that you want to talk about today that could be important to voice?
I think just the kind of the point, that we were really focusing on is that the language of a group often exists to hide the reality. I think is one of the biggest things, that the way that things are explained, right? If you explain to somebody that you're a community that everybody is cared for, they contribute using their best skills and you're cared for, everybody's cared for equally, and the children are educated equally and nobody goes without and nobody is poor and nobody is rich and it's a family of faith. Like those things all sound good to a lot of people.
Sounds so innocent and safe.
It does. Like, how much more wholesome can it get, it
appeals to people in the outside.
Exactly. And they were far more evangelical, lowercase e, right? Of course, than the Hutterites. They're very interested and still are to this day, very, very interested in recruiting and bringing people in.
Okay.
So, and they exist more, I think, more in the Northeast. They have communities in a lot of different places, but more Northeastern, if I have my geography correct. But just to, I guess, my lesson from there and going, looking back and learning as we moved is when you're listening to the language of a religion, and how they explain something, to ask yourself, how would this actually be carried out in real life? How would this work? What would have to happen for this to work? How can everybody, all work together without somebody being in charge and telling everybody what to do? And what does that look like?
Wow. Yeah.
And to really start thinking about that in the context of whatever the situation may be. What are they selling versus how it would actually have to happen?
Right. Would you say, and when would you have said you noticed you started asking questions in your mind? You said it was when your friends would disappear. Like, some of this stuff brought questions up. Is that the beginning of a little bit of the confusion?
I think it brought questions up. And then again, the other thing I saw there is they called their ministry servants. But it was very, very clear that the servants' families were given a much higher level of privilege.
Okay.
And even as a little kid, you notice that, right?
Right.
You notice that, like,
Oh, yeah.
your friends are more wealthy or less wealthy than you, and that sort of life. But in a place where everybody is equal, but to sort of use George Orwell's term, everybody's equal, but some people are more equal than others.
You start seeing that.
You start seeing this privilege that's given to those in authority.
Yeah.
And that was the other thing that jumped out, and I have a little scene there in the book, and it's just from a child's perspective, right?
Right.
I had an experience where, I was a Christmas celebration they did, and they gave me a couple pieces of candy, and I thought it was amazing. And then I learned that my friends who were, servants' children got, a whole lot more attention, and I thought everybody was equal. And it wasn't a big issue, but like sort of that moment, in your childhood where you pause and you're like, this isn't fair. I don't understand the words necessarily, but this isn't fair.
Yeah.
Why, if everybody's equal, why are some people treated differently?
I think that's why a kid's perspective is so powerful. And I really, really appreciated how you wrote your book through the lens of your child's soul, because the soul of a child is so authentic and pure, and you pick up on that stuff. You might not have words for it till you're an adult, and you see, you observe, and it's something how you start to see those double standards so quickly. Like, we say this, but is this equality? Fascinating. Yeah.
Right. And it was really important for me to write the book from that perspective. And in the end of the book, I reflect a little, on some of my experiences, but most of it was very important for me to show it. I don't go in there and tell you what you're supposed to think about the situation, or I try very, very hard not to.
Yeah.
But I like to show the reality for what it is. So I will, as I'm writing, I'll talk about, hey, my parents are explaining, or this group is explaining, and then I'll show you the scenarios of how it unfolds, and try to let you as a reader conclude what you're seeing. And that was how I was telling that piece.
I think that's the best way to tell this, because the complexities of these forms of, I would say, subtle control. I mean, it's more clear later. You've become an adult, and it's not quite as subtle as it felt when you're within the experience as a kid. But there is a lot of complexities to it, and I think telling the story really does bring that to a light in a way that I don't know how else you could enlighten it other than the story itself,
Right. Yeah.
And from the heart.
And, I thought, hey, if I came in with an adult voice in those childhood memories, as 8 years old, I didn't understand. 9 years old, authoritarian hierarchy. Like, I wouldn't have known that phrase, right? But if I had come in and said that, I felt like I would have sort of polluted the experience, or the narrative. But also, I wanted it to come through how these manipulating and controlling tactics are even evident to young children. These aren't just things adults are doing and the children are fine.
Right.
These things are affecting children at a very, very young age and leaving an emotional, train wreck behind.
Yeah.
Even to a young child who cannot articulate it.
Right.
It's still having a huge impact. And I wanted that to come through.
Yes, absolutely. So the third community, then you went from the Bruderhof. I have a hard time saying that word.
Yeah, Bruderhof. Yeah.
There's what then did something come up again where within the community your father was like, oh, they're not working for me, like
Yeah, they I don't know all of the details, but they have as it was sort of was explained to me, they have a very rigid process for which people join them. My parents embarked on that process, and part of the process sometimes asked people, kind of like my friend was sent away. So from my perspective, it was just like that, where they will send another family away to reflect. I don't know how universal that is. I had kind of gathered from conversations that there was some friction potentially with my parents and some of the church leaders potentially. I'm not sure. My parents were asking to continue on that journey to join, and so we ended up sort of getting sent away, kind of like the kid I was talking about, except we got sent 2 hours away to live on a River Brethren farm in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So another huge leap. But from my childhood observation, my parents also did not take it as a positive step towards their journey to join. They took it as being pushed away.
Right.
Although they continued to want to go back for quite a while.
So they were basically being punished or
it's
put out to go through some type of phase so they could come back and be more
be more committed, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, was the way they would have put it, like to ensure you're ready to completely commit, because you not that my parents had any assets, but they you sign over everything. You are not allowed to retain any property whatsoever. So they the words that I heard as a child were like, we send you away to make sure you are sure. The behavior of my parents and my emotions were that we were being rejected.
Right.
So
the words spoken of what was to be versus what the experience. So different. Wow. So you were at the River Brethren community then. What was your experience in the River Brethren community?
So my personal experience, and I try very hard to limit the book, although there are people who have allowed me to share their stories as they were parallel with mine. Try to limit it to my personal experience. And personally, it was a culture shock for me again. But it was they treated me well as a child.
How old would you have been at this point?
So at this point I would have been 10.
Okay.
I believe. 9, 10. And I went to school with them for a year. I had a lot of fun there. Some of the kids picked on me quite a bit because I wasn't from a plain background, but there were also some kids I made really good friends with. So there was some challenge there, but as a whole, they were relatively kind to me. I think the issues there really, really started when my father's mental illness really started exploding at that point. And for me, that time was with the River Brethren was sort of this neutral time from a religious perspective, because they live in, people have their own houses, you have your own jobs, you compared to the Bruderhof are much more, again, I hate the word normal, but much more standard, style of living. They're not in a commune.
And you just come from two different bodies. Yes.
And so I felt lonely. I think would be the first thing is like I used to waking up and having a bunch of other kids around, and suddenly it's just, my sister and I again. So there was some loneliness from there, but I went to school. For me, I think as my dad's illness exploded, I was during those couple of years, that was really what absorbed most of my attention. Again, that group was another plain group. I think that a lot of people have heard of them. I know you know that.
Right. Yeah. But
a lot of they're not as well known as a lot of the Anabaptist groups, and they're pretty small in comparison to. When I'm explaining them to somebody from the outside, I like to compare them to Mennonites, although they would object quite a bit themselves. But from an outside looking in, it feels somewhat similar.
I mean, people in the, would you say, secular world would never have even heard of
them. No,
I mean, they are a very, very small group.
right? And even my extended family who was outside at the time were like, oh, we just tell everybody you're Mennonite. And my parents would be like, oh, no, you can't say that we're Mennonites. And they're like, well, we can't tell the difference.
I know.
And they can't. There are difference in practice, dress, and doctrine.
Yeah.
But from a secular perspective,
no one gets it.
Right, nobody gets it.
No. Which makes sense, unless you're raised within all these different settings. I can only imagine the confusion.
Right.
And those of us raised in it, we got quite confused too.
We did too. And that's one of the things, I think maybe one of my biggest takeaways from that, sort of as an adult looking back on it from the, the religious perspective, is how the detail, I guess, the what I would now in my perspective, speaking for myself, not for them, call splitting hairs.
Yeah.
In doctrine, in ways that they would make decisions about salvation. That was when, I first started seeing, conversation with a Mennonite or River Brethren, but, arguments and how somebody's cut of cape and apron was more worthy of salvation than somebody else's, almost like that.
Let's talk about that a little bit. So did you notice, my question is what did you notice conversation-wise within, let's say, River Brethren versus a Mennonite or a Mennonite versus Amish? Did you notice conversations among people of like me versus you?
Yeah.
What did you pick up on with that? These are all plain Anabaptist groups, but they're all different.
Very different. And there was several different things. Clothing, again, this is, I think part of it was my age too, and sort of hitting a certain age while we were there in the River Brethren. But that's where clothing really started to jump, because between each of the two groups that we lived
in, when you say clothing,
we had to completely change our outfit, right? Every group had a uniform, right?
It was clothing.
And so then in the River Brethren, they had yet a different outfit, right? A completely different one.
That's really how you differentiated.
Yeah, it was very, very, very specific. And, well, I don't think a lot of people who I witnessed would have said, say, hey, somebody's going to hell for wearing a Mennonite dress versus a River Brethren dress. It was definitely a divider in church and your practice of faith. Yep. Whereas now I'm sitting here in jeans and you're sitting here in a dress and nobody's even thinking about it. Whereas there, our dresses would have had to be exactly the same cut.
Absolutely. And you are thinking about it.
Yeah. And you're
looking at that cut.
Definitely thinking. And people were sitting there, well, we don't wear that Mennonite. I mean, I'd hear these conversations all the time. Well, their dresses are too short, or their belts are too tight, or, well, their head coverings go about an inch too much farther back. And like the River Brethren have a very distinctive bonnet, right, compared to some of the Mennonites. It sort of sits slightly different.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of, well, ours covers it, this way, which is more appropriate, and theirs are too far back here. And we're talking about inches, inches of hair, but they had a certain like frill on the back of their dresses, right, that like others didn't, and like wearing that was sort of your manifestation of your correctness of your faith, right? Like that you had this
exact way to put it.
Frill. And it wasn't necessarily that Mennonite peer is damned, but you were more saved somehow. I mean, they you were more holy.
That's what it was perceived as. Yeah.
Yeah. And part of their in the River Brethren Church, which I was noticed is a little bit different from a lot of the Anabaptist churches, is that the children, particularly the female children, you didn't automatically start wearing a head covering in that uniform until you asked to. So you would go between the ages of like 10, 11, 12, I want to dress plain now. And so, usually around that age, you'd be like, oh, I want to dress plain. And so they'd give you the outfit, right? You would get that full, River Brethren outfit. Yeah. And it was wearing that specific uniform was sort of your expression to the world that you were on the right path.
Absolutely.
You had now we're wearing this exact cut of clothing. And so that, sort of started getting woven into my experience there, that like your clothing and that beginning of that ironic fixation on outer appearance from a group that's so much about modesty, right? But that's where that, sort of started was, you have to have this exact outfit.
Which brings me to think of a word that came up as you were describing all these details. I just thought of like the objectification of women. And what would you have to say about that? Like, I have experienced a lot of the objectification within these cultures that really focus on dress and detail and modesty. And what did you see going on with that?
And that started, there, and then really especially, moving in sort of to the, and we can kind of, go back and forth in the story, moving on, to the next community I ended up in.
Sure, take us
So
to there, and then we can get back to
Yeah, no, because it's all layered together. So there's no, it's threads of a common thread happening in different locations.
right.
But yeah, so to kind of explain after that, my father's mental illness, the River Brethren Church wasn't really equipped to handle it. I don't know exactly what they thought, but they sort of said, he'd refused to work at that point, and they kind of said, we're not going to keep caring for you. You need to go get, I don't know, Medicaid, whatever, external resources to try taking care of yourself. And he thought that wasn't blasphemous, and essentially within, a short time kind of huffed off to this off-grid commune that had been started by one of the most well-known Amish bishops at the time. If you're in those backgrounds, you've heard of Pathway Publishing. He was like the primary editor of that before he left and started this community. If people from outside probably aren't familiar with it, but a lot of, the Pathway publications run a lot of Anabaptist homes in my experience.
Yes, yes.
But he had gotten together with some other older Amish, some Mennonite, and some secular folks, and started this, again, lowercase evangelical, wanting to bring people in and convert people, this off-grid, very, very strict. People from the outside called it Amish commune. They did not necessarily call themselves Amish, although the expression was very Amish, but in a communal sense. But with them, they brought even more than I started to notice in the River Brother, and they really started to bring that extreme attention to modesty. And by modesty, I don't just mean not wanting your kid to wear a bikini or something. I'm talking about this fixation, this absolute fixation on the female body and blaming women for being women, more or less.
Ain't that something?
Right. And I think we talked about this before, but that was where I first started feeling objectified and sexualized to an extreme. And they're all about, purity culture, right? You're not, and yet I remember being a very young teen and being pulled aside on multiple occasions saying, the men are able to see your shape through your clothes and they're having lust issues and you need to start wearing your clothes even looser. And we were in head to toe clothes. We're not.
You're already full sack, head to toe.
You're covered. You're completely covered.
Yeah.
And I never felt more conscious and more like this sort of piece of meat on display than I did in those Amish dresses.
Wow.
The hyper attention, and it even started to jump out to me then. I remember coming from a secular background.
Yeah.
Right. As a little kid running around in shorts and t-shirts, and nobody was staring at us.
Looking. Yeah.
And nobody, my mom, I remember certain conversations about modesty to an extent, but she would wear shorts and a t-shirt and nobody was unable to control their overwhelming urges because she went to the grocery store, and so I did have some of that background, even though I was very young, being out of it. I think the contrast for me was more stark. Whereas some of the other girls there who had been raised in that didn't even think twice, and it made me uneasy at first, and was, incredibly confusing, because you're talking about all of this purity and, extreme purity culture. And by that, I mean, we were barely even allowed to talk to boys, right? Basic necessary communication.
Right.
But to sit around and just boys and girls playing together, you didn't do.
So it's basically that was sexualized too, because everything is so sexualized in the name of purity.
Right.
Oh, so conflicting what one was told versus what they experienced.
Yes. Extremely, because we were told, and I talk about it later in the book, how horrifically this impacts your ability to learn boundaries as a as a young adult,
Right.
is we were essentially told that interactions with males would spark. And they didn't even explain to us what, if I can say sex on this podcast,
Absolutely, yeah.
they didn't even really explain to us what that was.
Right.
But somehow, if young men and young women, and by that I even mean 12 and 13-year-olds, are in the same room, it would somehow, I don't know, spark these insatiable urges in us that would lead us to immediate damnation. You know how
Absolutely. It was an unspoken vibe, you're saying?
yeah. You know,
The
I knew it was
unsaid.
like there's these temptations. We were always told about these huge, terrible temptations.
But no clarity on what
With
they
no
were.
clarity. Yeah, no, but but we were told things we definitely couldn't do. Like we were not, even holding hands during dating was not acceptable.
Okay.
Like physical contact. And again, you're in your child's mind, you're trying to figure out exactly what this means, but it's, electricity is going to come through you and you're going to, I don't know, fall off a cliff into some kind of perverted sin. I don't know.
Yeah.
But like for a place that wanted, was so focused on complete chastity until marriage and, modesty for everybody, I felt like a huge percentage of our thought was fixated on how we looked and how sexual our appearance was, even though we didn't quite know what that meant, right? But lust provoking and how, how much time we had to spend not thinking about boys or not thinking about girls or,
Right.
not being alone. And so it had the exact opposite effect. Whereas, now I living in a secular society, I don't run around spending hours and hours obsessing and panicking over the fact that my blouse might be causing all these men to sin. I don't think about or
horrific if you think about it.
Yeah. And I don't feel violated constantly. I mean, and it was like I remember, and I didn't know why I felt violated, but because I didn't have the language as a child or a young woman. But I would feel like almost like somebody had been watching me change clothes without my permission when I would hear these comments of, oh, men in the church are complaining because they can see that you have female shape. Like I would feel so ashamed and embarrassed that how could somebody be looking at me like that. And I'd feel the violation, but I was told that it was my sin.
Right.
So somehow this
projected onto you.
This shame was mine, and I didn't know how to deal with it.
No child does.
Yeah.
That's what's devastating. And you learn these messages and you're just a kid. It's wow. So that's the subject I'm so passionate about, is just that objectification. I found it fascinating how you were like describing how like the very thing that was so they were speaking to prevent was the very elephant in the room.
Yeah.
So often is that pattern.
Yeah, they created the exact thing.
Created the very
and again, now that I have lived out of that background and I see, say, young men being grown up, I have a son of my own, a husband. Neither of them are struck with uncontrollable lust because a 14-year-old rides their bike down the street in a pair of shorts, right? Nor would I ever suggest to a decent man that they had so little self-control.
Right?
Like why?
How demeaning.
How demeaning to everybody.
It really is demeaning to all the genders if you really think about it.
Yeah.
Like the brainwashing, it really just, it's really heartbreaking.
But it turns into grooming, and especially of the young men. I mean, they are told from an early age, you're going to be lusting after even your own sister. Some of the literature we were given to read, talked about, how as, an 11-year-old girl, your brother seeing in your nightgown can lead him to sin. Like first of all, what kind of sick thought is that to put in a kid's head?
Yes.
But the boys are taught that too. And they grow up as men being taught that they are, in my language now, that they are taught that they are uncontrollable animals, that these filthy women are leading into constant sin, and not to even learn how to control your own lust because it's the women's fault.
Right.
There's no self-control or internal boundaries there of I respect a woman's visual space.
Right.
They're taught that, oh, it's the woman's fault and you're
doomed to this life.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so it just leads into this, and I talk about it more, it leads into this devastating spiral of sexualization and grooming that leads you incapable of, understanding appropriate sexual behavior, whether it's yours or other people's violation of you.
So, Michelle, where were you guys at with your father's mental illness then within the Amish community? How did they respond to your father's mental illness? And what did you see the religion belief system? Like, how did that impact your family with this experience?
And that's really a huge part of this story. So thank you for bringing it up. What I learned pretty quickly is that there's not, to begin with, they don't have a lot of language around mental illness in those communities, especially the one I was in. It was viewed as either, in my dad's case, somebody making something up or as a result of sin, right? So not just even in my dad's case, but even as women or even women going through postpartum depression, it was, if you were anything but mentally healthy and joyful, you were somehow separated from God, whether, the illness itself was sin or it was a sign of your lack of faith in another area of your life that was manifesting, right? There was no real acknowledgement that somebody could have a true mental illness in the same form that you can have a physical illness. And sometimes even physical illnesses were blamed on sin too. So not a surprise, not a surprise there.
Yeah.
But so for my dad, it's hard to know exactly what his challenges were. He passed away still refusing psychiatric help.
Right.
But by all appearances, he struggled with some type of schizoid personality disorder, which led to a lot of extreme paranoia, different sort of major mood fluctuations, and again, his continual, I guess, unwillingness or inability to believe that he could work. So he, again, these cultures that I was in are very work focused, and he didn't want to support his family. I ended up supporting my family for the most part, within a couple of years of moving there. But part of his mental illness were some sort of delusions, I guess, of delusions of grandeur would be the I think the medical phrase. And he started to believe that he was a prophet. Now in those Amish and Mennonite, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but especially your more old order groups, I have not observed a lot of comfort with people getting direct messages from God and being God's ambassadors.
That was pretty looked down on. I mean, I grew up girl in this, so yeah. Anyways, I word from God, everyone was kind of like, yeah, what's that?
What's that? Much less taking it to the point where you're like, I am a prophet and I am getting these visions, and they were, again, far more authoritarian than maybe a more secular church would be, right? So to go tell your bishop as somebody not in the ministry at all, that God is giving you these images that everybody needs to listen to, didn't really go over very well, to say the least, right? They were trying to be slightly more open-minded and, maybe question some of the more old order perspectives that they were bringing in, but it's still, it did not sit well, especially when he paired it with the fact that, he's also way too sick to work to support our family. And I could go on about, sort of the wide range of changing symptoms. But for them, the bottom line is that they didn't see this as somebody dealing with a mental illness who needed support and psychiatric help. My mom at the same time continued to kind of enable him where she should have known. But they ended up, at this point, I'll backtrack just a tiny bit. When I first moved there, I was very, pardon me. When I first moved there, I was very hostile to being there. I'd gotten comfortable again, didn't want to move again. And it's a big piece of the book, but kind of to summarize, they were so, they essentially isolated me from everybody. And this will tie back in. Essentially, isolated me from everybody. I tried to escape by writing to some outside family. And that's where the Judas girl term kind of first comes in, right? Is they checked the mail going out, right? Any communication that was going out was monitored, and I didn't realize that they were checking that.
That broke my heart, girl. When I read that part of the book, I think I held my breath. Was so excited that day when you wrote that letter to your grandparents. I was just like, I was sold on your story at that point. I was like, yes, she's going to write to the grandparents and they're going to pick her up. And then when they found the letter, I was just like, no.
Yeah.
Community ripped it up.
Yeah. They found the
Never
letter.
the grandparents. It's just, that got me.
But they confronted me with it, you know. And again, I'm 14. So at 14, I think I'm an adult, but I'm a child.
Yeah.
They confront me with it. Really, both my parents and, you know, the leader who I pseudonym Wayne in the book, you know, and his wife, you know, they all, you know, confront me with this, and, you know, essentially are like, you're always going to be, you don't even really mingle with the other children because it's so toxic. But that's where the Judas term came in, because my dad at that point told me, for wanting to leave and writing this letter, that I was worse than Judas Iscariot.
So you wrote a letter to your grandparents, basically telling them about some of the abuse, and that you need help. Yeah. Like, could you come pick me up?
Yes.
It was like your rescue cry.
Right.
Or a cry for help.
Right.
They found it. The community found it. Your parents were horrified and called you
Judas. And that's, I think,
it's just
why, you know, and it's why, again, like using the word cult, why I chose that as a title, because I wanted to emphasize, and that was my dad's phrase at that time, but you'll see there's later places in the book where how seriously they treat you for violation of any of their rules.
Oh my, yeah.
You aren't just not walking close enough to God, or whatever phrase you might want to use. You are a traitor to the faith entirely. And that level of being branded a traitor over and over again, especially, and I say this because my dad's mental illness ties back into this, where we were going earlier. Yeah. Being a traitor was such a big piece of the mind control. Like, if you weren't fully on board, you were totally gone. There was not a lot of acceptance of variation in belief, but
how terrorizing to tell a child they're like that, you know, the person in the Bible, which we were all, you know, taught, the person in the Bible that was the unpardonable,
the ultimate worst
criminal or sinner or whatever the worst case scenario character is that these religions will use to terrorize kids into compliance.
Yeah.
And that is something I feel like is really important to name, because you're terrorizing and controlling the minds of innocent children, and that terror works until it doesn't.
Right.
But
it makes a huge impact for years to be told as a child that you're worse than the person who betrayed Jesus, when you're raised on Jesus, and then be told, oh, your behavior infraction makes you worse than the person that betrayed Jesus. What kind of message does that send?
How does a child interpret that? Like, that just,
you can't. I couldn't. I didn't know where to put it. Honestly, I still don't. You know, I don't think there's a way that I can reconcile adults saying that to a child in any kind of rational world. But, you know, that broke me down finally. Just the constant pressure, psychological pressure, emotional pressure. And I finally got on board, I guess is what you'd say. You know, I got baptized and joined that community, you know, with, you know, the constant pressure of my parents and the constant pressure of the church there. You know, I couldn't cope with, you know, I couldn't hold my own mental space anymore, and it just collapsed. And I emphasize that because as things unfolded, my dad's mental illness began to get a lot worse. And like we were talking about earlier, you know, him claiming he was a prophet, his refusal to work, they eventually collaborated behind his back with a doctor that they essentially bought off, I guess, who was a German Baptist doctor, but another Anabaptist group, but much more progressive, right? And essentially, you know, wrote this doctor and was like, you need to tell this church member of ours that he's making all this stuff up and he just needs to, like, get over it and repent. Like, but he needs to hear it from a doctor. So, which there's so many things to unpack there. That's not even
This
legal.
is another Anabaptist guy.
Yeah.
This is not a doctor.
Yeah, he was an MD.
Okay.
He was an MD, which makes it even worse because this guy knew what the ethical boundaries were. Like, he had to swear that oath, and he had to know what the privacy violations were. So that to me, that almost made it worse because he had no excuse. But again, it was sort of, to me, an example of how their ends often justify their means, right? Like, well, if you're saving a soul, then I don't know if HIPAA was enacted back then, but throw privacy out the window,
Absolutely.
throw doctor-patient confidentiality out the window, and from everything I understand, it was just this sort of ceremonial isn't the right word, but token thing they put my dad through to kind of prove to him what they believed in this community. So he went, he sees this doctor, the doctor's like, there's nothing wrong with you, it's in your head, you need to go back and repent. And my dad finds out that the leader of this community had written to this doctor and had planned this all out beforehand.
Yeah.
And although my dad's behavior throughout the story was highly inappropriate in a lot of ways, that was a violation of him.
Absolutely.
But what happened is I was then faced with my dad having a very legitimate reaction to this personal violation and completely rejecting this community that I had been so harshly brainwashed into fully accepting.
Right.
And it left me at an absolutely impossible intersection of I have to either, because now I'm a community member, if I betray what the community believes, I'm a traitor. But if I support my family, my dad had already called me worse than Judas, I'm also a traitor. Like, there's no way that I can keep what I believe my faith was and my family. There was the two could no longer coexist. So my parents, of course, at that point, I say, of course, based on their patterns of behavior, decided it was time to move again.
Yeah, so many patterns.
Yeah.
Wow.
But here I am now, a full church member, fully indoctrinated, fully embracing of all of these sort of toxic beliefs that we've been talking about through this entire conversation,
right.
Fully internalized, fully believing. And then they decide to leave and go, most of the story to this point have been Anabaptist groups. Even though they were different, there was still commonalities across the belief structures.
Yeah.
And they moved to this fringe Eastern Orthodox Christian commune, which is not Baptist at all. And to me, I don't know about your experience, but I remember so many sermons about the idolatry of things like iconography, rehearsed prayers, all of these, all of these.
Oh, I hear ya.
All of these things were just absolute idolatry, right? Like I had even heard it said that people like, Catholics and Eastern Orthodox were worse than being atheists.
Huh.
I'd heard that expressed multiple times. 'Cause at least atheists didn't believe in God at all, whereas these people were worshiping idols, They were.
So you're moving into this, fourth cult with all these perspectives, all these teachings, and now
yes,
the world.
Yeah, and so as a church member, it was super confusing for the community I was leaving because, again, the authority of the church is before your husband or father, and I reiterate there in those communities, a woman was always under authority.
Yeah,
especially like in the one I was in, like they would preach it very clearly. A woman was never not to be under someone's authority, and if you even ended up as a single older woman, you still needed to essentially have some male that you reported to, whether it was your brother or a church leader, right? You were always under male authority.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So but there was this, you were also supposed to be completely submissive to this person to whom you were under authority. So they had a conflict there to where I had to be submissive and obedient to the church, but also had to be submissive and obedient to my father, who was asking me to engage in idolatry. So there was an intersection there again that didn't work. And it was confusing for me because I had two core belief systems. One had to be ignored, but both were going to send me to hell, right? Disobeying my father was a sin and disobeying the church was a sin, and I couldn't obey them both, not even close.
Wow.
So the cognitive dissonance there was overwhelming. But, what they decided to do was, hey, we're going to send her to, we'll send her with her parents to help them move. Like, we'll give this nod to submission. My parents at this time didn't even really like me. They had tried to abandon me a few weeks before, after the whole story with the doctor went down. They had tried to run away and hid in the woods overnight and left me a note, telling me that I'd failed them, essentially. And, so they didn't even necessarily want me, but I had a father who had to be submissive to all these competing doctrines now. And so they asked me to go help them move to this new commune, stay there for a few weeks, get them set up, and then, the community I was living in, we'll come and we'll get you and we'll bring you home, And I was 16 at this point.
Okay.
And just, kind of to add just a slight layer of background, they were one of those, like the old order Amish, didn't believe in advanced education, right? So I'd been pulled out of school at 8th grade. So I was going out into this, to what maybe the outside world seemed slightly like an insular commune, but was far more wide open to these worldly behaviors,
Sure.
right, than I was used to.
Compared to what Anabaptists.
Compared to what the Anabaptists were, and definitely compared to this insular commune that I was in, where most of us didn't even have running water, I went in and I turned on a tap and water came out and I lifted a switch and like,
whoa,
it's like,
what parts of the world are like?
I have a scene there that I just put in for the hilarity of it, where I couldn't figure out how to do laundry, just nothing.
Because before the Orthodox Russian, is that what it's
the Russian Orthodox commune?
Russian Orthodox. Before that, what type of wash machines did you use?
So they called them James washers, but they were just this tub, right? Like half circle tub that you filled with hot water and had a handle with sort of an agitator.
Not a wringer washer.
It had a wringer on it, but you would hand agitate.
I know that's what the Amish use.
Yeah, and you would slosh it back and forth, and then you would put it through the wringer. But it was completely done by hand. Like, I know some of the Amish friends I'd had, they had like, some of them would have a gas motor or like a pulley. But this was completely hand agitated wringer washer.
Yeah.
When you'd ring it and then you'd hang it on the line. But like, I had no idea like how to operate a washing machine.
See, this new community had regular electric wash machines.
Right. They had
a whole new world.
Normal modern technology. I mean, they weren't like into advanced technology, but they had the things that most houses would. They sort of lived a little rustically, but you had a gas stove and a washer and a dryer and a light switch and a hot shower, things that were incredibly novel now and foreign to me after living most of my childhood in this. So I get in this place, though, and it is completely overwhelming. And here's kind of where I want to circle back on some of the danger of not teaching kids about sexuality, or this hypersexuality and these lack of boundaries, and the whole rigid set of rules across the board that we were raised with is you are not ever taught to think for yourself, whether it's what you do with your body or somebody else does to your body in a sexual sense, or even what outfit you want to wear. I mean, aside from, do I want to wear blue or green today?
Right.
Your ability to make choices based on your own morality, based on your own logic and reasoning, is never taught.
It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist at all. And so suddenly I was thrust out there with my parents into this whole new world, where people were giving me massive amounts of information that I had never heard.
Okay.
People were behaving in ways I had never seen people behave. Like boys were having conversations with me. Like they were walking up and talking to me like that was a normal thing to do to people. And I had no idea what to do with any of this information.
Yeah.
People were telling me I should get more education. I like school. I had studied on my own, but where do I put this? What is, I was like, I think I know what I believe. I've been brainwashed into this. I mean, that wasn't the word I used, but I've been brainwashed into this cult. But suddenly, when provided contradicting information or stimuli or, anything, I had no tools to go back and say, well, this is why I believe what I do. I believed what I did because if I didn't, I was Judas.
Right.
Not because, and I didn't recognize it at the time, but not because I had learned and studied and created my own, own morality, come to understand God in my own way, had developed my own faith, my own sense of what I wanted out of life, what I needed out of life. It had never occurred to me that life would be anything other than me getting married very young and having children. Like, there was no choice, no thought there. So I had nothing to fall back on when I was faced with this information, because instead of black and white, I had to make logical choices about things. I had to process new information and decide what I thought. And I had no idea how to do this.
I relate to that.
Yeah.
I absolutely relate to that process.
But where I think the most damaging things come in is, with what I talked about with sexuality.
Yeah.
So I assume that if boys were talking to me, this was a sinful situation. This is a highly charged sexual situation.
Yes. Dude, just brings all the memories back. Highly charged as soon as you're looking at the opposite sex.
Right. And I expected boys to be animals.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what set me up for what happened. So I started, I'm 16. This is the first time I'm having conversations with a boy. I find out that this is interesting. I kind of like this boy.
Yeah.
Well, 16-year-olds do this, but not where I came from. And, one thing led to another. And, there with the purity culture, if you cross that line, you're a whore forever. I'll just say,
yes,
if you have sex before marriage, it doesn't matter. Even in the stories I heard, even in my youngest years, it doesn't matter if you're 50. People know that she was the woman who had sex before she married her husband. She's a whore. It's funny that I never heard that said about the men. I never heard about men who had sex before they were married. So clearly these women only had ever done it with themselves, right?
Because as you say that, my brain is bringing back my experiences within my cult, and I'm like, you're right. I don't remember hearing about the boys. It was the women.
Yeah.
It was always the girl. And we all know the ones that were the ones.
The transgressors, yes. The
girls. Okay.
The ones who are the whores forever. Yeah. And I'm like, but who are they having sex with?
That was the missing part.
Yeah.
The missing element.
And so I crossed that line. I was a 16-year-old. I had no idea what boundaries were. I thought essentially that if I held hands with somebody, it was the same sin anyway.
Yeah.
So once I had done that, but then I felt that sort of tore my world apart, because here I am still thinking I'm in this Amish faith, essentially. I'm here with my parents. I have now engaged in activities with this boy.
Yeah.
And like the community I'd come from, we had a young woman there who had done a similar thing, although not totally by her choice. And she was very publicly ridiculed and shamed and humiliated for months because of this transgression. And the adult man who was with her just left, and that was it. And so, not only did I know this from just the patterns of behavior, I had seen it. There was no, the public shaming was off the chart.
There was, again, we bring up this example that you mentioned earlier, the public shaming, the experience of punishment and judgment and condemnation. Everyone's witnessing, so like you already know,
right,
the thoughts and the programming of everyone within the community, just witnessing one person, because everybody knew.
Everybody knew.
And it creates, again, that terror.
Yeah, absolute terror. And their objective was, well, that terror should prevent other people from doing this. But it's kind of ironic because you don't teach people how to create their own boundaries. Mm-hmm. So how are they going to prevent it? And then also force, in this case, it was sort of I don't know all the details, but I understand it wasn't fully her choice. This was a teenager and an adult man. It doesn't even matter. There was an adult being inappropriate, but she was blamed.
That's abuse.
That's it. But that was not how we were taught.
She was taken advantage of by an adult. She was underage, and she was. Now I read the story. She was considered the sinner. Yep. And he
just left.
Was never called out.
Yeah, and then she
kind of caused him to stumble.
That was pretty much how it was explained. Yeah, women caused the men to stumble, and he left. He just completely left. And nobody, I've told people the story since, and they're like, well, why didn't people call the cops? And I'm like, that wasn't part of the conversation.
That was going to be my next question so there was no terminology for this is a crime.
No.
This is an underage child, an adult man taking advantage of the child. There's just no concepts.
No, none whatsoever.
Within these communities.
And when I talk about it to other people, people are like, no, I'm sure it just has to have been your memory at that age that I'm sure there were people there who wanted to call the police on this, and I was like, I can't say what was in somebody's head, but generally speaking, no, this was not viewed as crime. The communities I was in, even I would go as far to even say that true crimes against young children weren't called crimes. They were called sins or failures that required repentance that was handled within the church.
Right.
To bring in external law enforcement would have been another way to get called Judas. I mean, quite clearly, that would have been a betrayal of your entire construct of faith, right? Faith was about repentance and forgiveness, not criminal justice.
Right.
Criminal justice was of the secular world, and even that terminology, which we didn't even know most of, was not. That was something external from God,
Right.
And it would have been a sin, if not a worse sin, to bring in external authorities into an abuse situation.
Wow.
So again,
what a trap.
It's impossible. There's
I picture the whole scenario is just devastating.
Yeah.
Because the very resource for justice and safety is not an option.
Right. And then when you internalize that message, you now have young men, but especially young women, internalizing that crimes committed against them are their fault.
It's devastating.
And believing that. And so, we'll leap forward again in time to where I was and this happens. And I was like, to the boy I was seeing, I was like, no, we're not doing this. I still don't know what my faith is. And he wouldn't take no for an answer after that. And, I was dating somebody who was raping me, and I just thought it was my sin.
Right.
But I had to tell the community I was from, I was still a member, I had to tell them that, hey, I did this. I couldn't go back and hide it. Or we were told your husband will know on your wedding night, and you can't keep this a secret.
Yeah.
So, which is not true, but
right. Just again more of the terror mind.
But so yeah, exactly. So I told them, and then I told, they came to visit one time. A handful of the people from the Amish community came to the Russian Orthodox community to check on my parents, check on me, and I mentioned it to some of my female friends. They went back, and then they showed up a few days later with Wayne, as I call him in the book, some of the elder ministry and stuff in the group, and they're like, we're here to take you home and shun you. Yeah, great invitation. We have thrown you out here with your parents, right?
Yeah.
Your abusive parents into this new commune with no way to handle your own emotions, no way to reason yourself through anything. And now we'll take you home and shun you. And I kind of said, it was like, I don't think I want to do this. Like where I was a center of idolatry, but the idea of being this whore and for the rest of my life because things got out of control, and they didn't even know that a lot of it wasn't consensual. I didn't either.
Right. This the thing just devastates me. Just the whole program that sets this up. It's just so wrong.
And it's why, it was really hard to share in the book. There was a part of me, that wanted to kind of wrap up the book without going into some of those experiences, right? They're the hardest to share. But I thought, to me, I could talk about how I lived in this Amish community and then my parents moved out and I figured out secular life and end of story. But that's the thing, is you don't just walk out. I feel like there's this myth. I'll hear people talk about, say, Old Order Amish or Mennonites or different communities. And they're like, well, it's just their way of life. And the kids can leave when they're 18 if they want to.
If only.
I've heard that line or that same concept many, many times. And no, you cannot. Maybe somebody can even, like in my situation, physically pull you away, but you cannot leave in your head. You are in the mind control. You are living in concrete walls.
The psychological and emotional abuse is mind-numbing.
It is.
I mean, how else do you describe it?
And it leaves you with no tools. You know, I had, again, something people have told me, especially when they didn't fully understand my background or the context, you know, we're like, well, you made choices. Yes. I mean, everybody makes choices, but you can't make a choice you don't know you have.
Right.
You can't make good choices if you don't have good choices. And, you know, in that situation, I had no good choices.
Yep.
Or if I did, I didn't know that I could pick up the phone and call an outside agency and find people that would tell me, you know, that I wasn't some whore and that I was being sexually abused and that I could get an education that could I didn't know that was a thing, right? So yeah, that was technically a choice, but I didn't know that there was anybody who could even help me.
There was zero resources and education for that idea.
Right. And so you can have a world of choices, but if you don't know they exist, they may as well not be there.
Yep.
And that was a huge part of the package, is we didn't know these choices existed. So, you know, I you know, going back to the storyline, you know, I told them, I guess I'm not coming back with you. It was just too overwhelming after seeing what this other girl had gone through. I was like, I can't. I don't know. I didn't know where that left me. But I'm not going back. And so I ended up finding out I was pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the idea, of course, from that culture, it wasn't like, oh, hey, I'm in an abusive relationship with a boyfriend. I'm going to not get married. I'm going to be a single person and, you know, raise my child. That was not a choice that I thought I had. Right. I didn't think, my only choice was to get married. I didn't know there was another choice. And I had people, again, when it comes to choices, I've had people ask me since, well, why would you marry somebody who was doing that to you? You chose that. I didn't know there was another choice. I mean, people there were words that were said, but they weren't real choices.
Right.
At least in my mind with my indoctrination, there were no other choices.
Right.
So I ended up getting married to somebody who was emotionally, psychologically, and sexually abusive. And now you're even, you know, more trapped. And this is somebody who only have an 8th grade education. Even as I started to learn that there was a world out there that thought what had happened to me was wrong, I also started to learn that I had no tools to engage with this world.
Wow.
And yeah, it ended up, I slowly started to piece things together.
Yeah.
Very painfully while staying in this abusive relationship. I finally did start studying. I did get a GED.
Yeah.
You know, it took several years.
Yeah.
I started going to college. And again, I like to touch on this point because I feel like so many stories get told in a way that like you cross this magic threshold and suddenly you're great and interacting in the world and everything's behind you. And it keeps going.
Yeah.
Right. I ended up, you know, in college and I ended up going into this women's studies class. And I talk about it in the book. Feminism to me was a dirty word, very dirty word. Right. I had to take it because it was an elective. And at this point, I had progressed from where I used to be.
Yeah.
But I was still very much in a sort of strictly religious mindset, you know. So I was prepared for all of these things that I was told that I was going to get taught. Like they're going to teach me, you know, all these, you know, things about, I wasn't even sure, but I'm like, they're going to teach me that women should get divorced and get abortions. That's what my mom told me feminism was. Feminism was women who wanted to get divorced and have abortions. And
yes. And we've been told all this within these churches. Yes. Now you're experiencing.
Yes. And nobody in my class nor my professors were talking about wanting to get divorced and have abortions. They were talking about women being, equal to men. But they were also talking about this thing about part of the way through the semester called rape culture.
Yeah.
And this was a huge epiphany to me because I heard the phrase and I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know what they're talking about. Somewhere in the world, like rape's
Was
promoted,
that your
right?
first time learning of the actual
That term
rape?
of rape. I had heard the term rape, but
Okay.
rape. So the context of rape, and we had talked about it just a little. It was solely in that context of if some strange guy jumped out of the woods and grabbed you and violated you, then we would have called that rape.
Right.
Rape could not happen in marriage.
Yep.
You were your husband's property, essentially.
Yes.
Your job as a woman was to fulfill his needs. So that definitely wasn't rape. My husband was violently assaulted me within days of me giving birth to one of our children, and
your upbringing was that's just the way it's supposed to be.
Right. That was, it was told that, he was, he was behaving inappropriately, but this wasn't rape, this was just being rude, like,
wow.
And yeah, so I understand that concept. And then definitely, like I talked about in the earlier examples, if a man you knew forced himself on you, you had led him to do that. So I wouldn't have applied the term rape to that.
Right.
So when I hear this phrase rape culture, I'm thinking that they must be talking about some weird society where strangers are jumping out of bushes and raping women.
Yeah.
And then I learned that this term rape culture is a culture where, and there's a lot of layers of it, but one layer of it is a place where women don't understand when they're being violated, where women are groomed to be the sexual property of men. Yeah. And that men, have rights, essentially have the right to our bodies, even in a marriage, and it was really, I think, through that experience that I fully understood both where I came from, that all of us as girls were raised as, like I said, I never felt more like a piece of meat than in my Amish clothes.
Unbelievable.
We were raised and groomed to be sexually violated,
right.
That we were sexually violated, and that my marriage was sexually violating. I was married to somebody who was raping me.
Right.
And also, though, I think it was my first year of school. I also was like realizing that, feminism were these women who respected themselves and made choices and got married later in, my putting it together in my very fundamentalist black and white perspective still, that to be a feminist and to not be this meant that I would have not chosen to marry this guy, that I wouldn't have had two children before I turned 20. So I internalized it, not because in that case of the way they were teaching it, but because of that black and white indoctrination I was used to, that I was just a failed teen mother.
Right.
And that I was either, from a religious perspective, a whore forever, or I was a failed teen mother. There was no future for me.
It just feels like you bring up this default pattern where the programming wired you to, again, take responsibility.
Right.
For
things that were completely...
This says something about me when it truly had nothing to do
with
who you were.
And
with the program sets one up to unconsciously go there.
Yeah.
Again and again.
You blame yourself. We were taught repeatedly to be accountable for every bad thing and to only thank God, and to thank God for every good thing. So if there was, and I'm not saying, you can't be grateful. I'm not talking about that at all. But if I make a mistake, my fault, my shame.
Yep.
If I make a right decision, God made the decision, not me.
Yep.
And so you continually internalize everything that you did. If wasn't the right choice, was your sin, right? So your shame. And I could not in that moment see that I had already come from an insular Amish background with 2 little children and was sitting in a college class after overcoming only an 8th grade education. I couldn't see that. I was incapable of understanding that I could make right choices, right? God made right choices. I made wrong choices. And all I could see were the wrong choices. And, to me, we've talked about mental health here. At that point, I tried to take my own life because I truly didn't think that there was any hope for me in the world, because all I had done was make wrong choices.
Right.
And at a certain point, why continue to be alive if all you can do is make wrong choices?
Yeah.
Um,
And there isn't hope in a trap within, like, when you're in a situation where you're forced to comply under such pressure. I feel like suicidality and suicide is often the only option that the mind has left to consider, Would you say that that's kind of like that was like, this might be my escape?
I think that was true. That was the only escape I had. And then I also truly believed that because of all my bad choices, I had truly failed everybody in my life, and they would truly, truly be better off without me. It was such a big driving factor.
Yeah.
I was, no matter what path I looked at it in, and again, feminism doesn't it doesn't teach that what I was internalizing, right? But I believe there's the way I was raised, there's one right way to do things, and if you don't, you're wrong.
Right.
So I didn't see this sort of discussion about women being free to get educated and make their own choices as sort of a spectrum of options. I saw it as something I'd failed to do.
Yeah.
And then I saw that my faith was something that I had failed to do. And I had a husband who was, I was learning at that time, like I said, I could have come to the realization that he was violating me, but I still had this in my head that I was forcing him to sin. I was still sort of thought that it was my responsibility. Even if I was using the R word, I was still somehow culpable for this. And so all my life was doing to that point was failing everybody. Myself, obviously, but everybody. I had completely failed God, my family, my children. I was a failure, and they would truly, truly be better off without me, because all I did was cause people to sin. And
just breaks my soul to just hear the process. It's truly devastating. Devastating. So you had the suicide attempt, and then where was that? That was within your marriage?
Right.
What was the next part of the timeline then?
So, for me, again, I'm not advocating anybody who's in that place, please reach out for help before trying anything. Fortunately, although I had a lot of bad experiences with the mental health community coming out of that, I had a few good ones and met a few very helpful.
Yeah.
And the most helpful person, I actually don't remember her name because I wanted to put her name in the book, for real almost, is just a nurse intern.
Yes.
Another young woman, not much older than me, but who had been raised entirely differently.
Mm.
And was the first person to really help me start to reframe my life and my decisions. And again,
in the book you mentioned the day that she started asking you shared your story with her, and then she gave you insights that I'd never
heard before.
Brought to your mind before.
It had never occurred to me, like I said earlier, that I couldn't be accountable for making choices that were the only choice I had.
Right.
Or making choices to survive, and she was the first person to reframe it as, look at how you were raised and look at where you came, and now you're raising 2 kids and going through college. And yes, you're in this abusive relationship, but like there's a lot of people your age who aren't there, who grew up in a secular society. Like, look, really just totally reframing, and also, giving me resources and helping me see that perhaps I wasn't the failure in this whole story, but it was the environment that I was raised in that was
profound.
And it was, yeah.
Whenever I read that part and she was chatting with you in the book, I'm just like, oxygen.
It was the first time,
oxygen.
The first time anybody had ever really told me that, it was shocking. And again, sadly, it'd been fun to end the story there and be like, oh, and I was like, oh, wow, that's true. And I live happily ever after.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, when it doesn't work, but it started the path to that.
Yes.
And nobody knows you're going to live happily ever after, I guess, until your life is over.
Right.
But it was the door that opened onto that path. And there was a lot ahead of it. But ultimately I ended up after another year or two leaving that marriage. Terrifying because of again, the way I was raised, you didn't get divorced. I ultimately did end up leaving that marriage, going into another relationship, ultimately getting married later. But that was sort of the beginning of that thought process for me that led out.
She was truly an empowering person. That was the beginning of your own empowering experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, it really was the first person to put that in my mind. And I continued going to school. That was part of it.
Yeah.
But
I've heard the pattern of education was important to you there.
It was incredibly. It helped me, education both from, say, her as a nurse, which wasn't academic education, but then education, true academic education, which really helped me give language to things that I felt but could never articulate.
Right.
And that was huge for me. But then also gave me, it wasn't so much the specific, say, degree I got, but the tools that it gave me to help me realize that I had the ability to reason through arguments, to, take information and assess it. Like, what a fascinating concept. And it really helped me. It also helped me start to understand some of my dad. I took, a psychology course, and they had terms and explanations for people who acted like my dad did.
Wow.
And nobody can diagnose him. He didn't go to a doctor, but I was able to recognize the behaviors, and also it helped me reduce a lot of self-blame again through that, by understanding, because my dad used me a lot in that journey as a pawn, sort of manipulating between him and my mother.
Yeah.
He was, I won't say he was inappropriate is true. They were just merely, not merely inappropriate. He was too physically comfortable with me, not a, but more as a manipulation tool. And so I had carried a lot of that, but realizing that somebody's mental illness is not your fault. First, that they are mentally ill.
Right. Clarity on that.
And then that wasn't I didn't do that. That wasn't my fault. The way he treated me, the way he had me act was not ever my fault. Like, being able to, I guess, take in all of this information, really started paving that road out.
Yeah. So you guys know how passionate I am about this work, and I know so many of you guys are as well. So we offer the opportunity for you to make a contribution to the link below. The more you contribute, the more of an impact that we can make. Thank you so much. It's just amazing how education can bring so much clarity, and clarity can bring closure and validation, and then releasing things that were never your fault. It's just incredible how just to hear the picture of how resources, and that is ultimately so profound on the experiences and changing those narratives.
And, there are a lot of ways, college was the one I chose. Like, there's a lot of different ways, to get that education, but
Yeah.
It's something, I would tell anybody coming out, or when I meet people who are coming out, is to try to connect them with resources that give them language to understand what they've been through.
This is good. I was going to say, what would you say to someone coming out of a religious controlled environment, in short, cult, however someone wants to verbalize it? You're saying that would be your insight. That probably the first thing you would advise is to get some resources.
It would definitely be one of them. I think, at least for me, what led me into such a downward spiral is I didn't know how to understand what I was feeling.
Right.
So of course, going with giving people resources would definitely be validating their feelings in that moment, right? Telling them that what you're feeling is real and it's okay to be confused. Reminding them, like I've said, that, you can only make the choices that you had. You grew up with a certain mindset. You can only think in the mindset, but at least, for people whose brains work like mine, giving them information to help them understand.
Yeah.
Like we talked about, the hypersexualization of women, giving me the language, and knowing that there were other people who had different language for this.
Yes.
Changed everything about it for me.
Yes.
And that's what I hope, somewhat to do with the book is, to kind of highlight these same struggles other people are going through.
Yep.
And how I learned to completely transform a childhood of indoctrination and brainwashing and internalizing all of these horrible things about who I was and flipping it upside down.
Wow.
And hopefully letting other people kind of witness my experience and maybe take some of those tools.
Yeah. And I know your book will be doing that for the readers, as it did it for me. It's just the story really paves a pathway, that your experiences pave a pathway of light on the darkness supernaturally. And it really gives words for experiences that when you're alone in them, you don't have words for. And I think that's going to be a huge gift to many men and women reading your book, is just the words and insight through the life of someone else. It can be a lifeline for sure.
Yeah, and that's my hope. I mean, that's the ultimate reason. Hopefully other people, maybe if you're not in that situation, you'll at least understand people who are better.
Yeah.
And understand that these cultures exist and are putting people through this.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, my biggest hope is that other people going through it will connect and have, at least see they're not alone. At least there's one other person,
Absolutely.
There are many of us, but
Yeah.
but yeah, not to feel so alone and to see that there is a path.
So is there anything else you wanted to mention in regards to the book?
I think the talking we covered the big topics. I do think, I talk a little bit more at the end of the book about how these teachings, this upbringing impacted some other people close to me, and kind of emphasize a little bit about the generational trauma. So if you read the book, I think that's, something I want people to continue to take away. This isn't something that just ends when somebody's 18. It goes on, it ripples throughout families, it ripples throughout generations. And I go into that a little bit more toward the end, but that's really the story. Like, we really covered it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you, Michelle, for everything you shared today. I think it's just incredible what you've overcome, the words that you have for your experiences. And ultimately, I want our listeners to just purchase your book and read it, because I'm amazed. I'm amazed how, I think just reading through the story the whole time, I was like, wow, she does such a good job describing the story, where it just trails into so many aspects so well. Like, the nostalgia of just some of your experiences as a little kid, even just like, you would go off to the woods and the breeze, and just like, I'm like, I just feel like I'm present with her at 11 years old. Like, it's very deeply intimate and emotional. And that's the style of writing I really enjoy. It's like you feel like you're in the story with that person. And then it really does validate so many aspects of religious mind control. So if you are someone who's been through religious abuse and confusion, I really do believe that Judas Girl is going to really paint a picture of clarity. And I highly recommend you purchase this book. You can find Michelle's book on Amazon and any platforms where you purchase books. So, Michelle, I'd like you to give us your website, your personal website information, since I know that's directly benefiting your book work the most, so that they can go ahead and directly purchase from it. What would the site be?
Yeah, and it is just MichelleStewartAuthor.com.
Okay.
Yep. And if you Google Judas Girl book or Michelle Stewart book, that website will come up too.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Now, that would probably also be linked on your Facebook page.
Yeah. So
that's a good spot to find it.
Yep. If you follow my Facebook page, I usually have a link in most of my posts that'll send you directly to that. Yeah, as well.
Perfect.
Yep.
And you can also find Michelle on Facebook. So definitely look up Michelle Stewart. That's the name of your Facebook page, right?
Michelle Stewart Author. Yeah.
I enjoy your page. You do a really good job of like putting teasers out of like what your book's about and your parts of your story. Michelle does tell parts of her story through her Facebook page too, that I'm like, I gotta read that. Like, you give little bits and pieces, because these stories are a lot, it's a lot of detail.
Yeah.
And I enjoy your teasers on your Facebook page. So for sure, look Michelle up on Facebook, give her a like, purchase her book on Amazon or wherever you like to purchase your books. And also, I would love if you guys would leave a comment here on our YouTube channel for Michelle to read. Our guests do read down through the comments. So what part of Michelle's story today resonated with you most? I would love for you to just leave a comment and just type out what part stood out to you, what part you relate to. That can be super insightful as well. So it also helps our videos reach more people. So I want to also, before we end, I want to add some of my thoughts to you, Michelle, on some of the book. Like I said, there was different parts of this book that had me just, speechless and emotional. Both.
Yeah.
No words but tears. And at the end, as I was reading, right close to the end, there's a phrase that I was reading, and I want to read that. It was Michelle kind of depicting her emotional experience, and it says, "A tear etched a path through the sweat crusting on my cheeks. I'm so sorry I got out and so many of you didn't. Their shadows held steadily next to me, but maybe I can help. I don't have all the answers, but there is a way out." When I read that, that was it. I had to stop and cry. And it's just deeply personal for me because I was like, I could have said that. It's just like, that's where like my heartbeat just was like, I felt that. Because when you go through an experience in a place where mind control runs so deep within a group, you quickly can basically, without saying no, what your fellow brothers and sisters are going through because they were under the same program by the same leader. And it resonated with me in the sense like the compassion and love that you have for those who are experiencing that psychological mind control yet. And your compassion, I think that's the part that just like I felt deep within. And I know that compassion comes through you sharing this story. What a gift to share that, your life story with others who are still navigating the complexity of, religious abuse.
And thank you for that. And thank you for reading that last piece, because that's really, that's what it's all about. It's about all of us who went through it and those who are still in it.
Yeah.
So thank you for helping me share that story for those people and for, letting me be on your platform to continue to reach out. I know this series does that for a lot of people. So thank you for letting me try to reach out to those girls that I was thinking about in that moment, and everybody else like them.
Yeah. What a gift and what an honor, and thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you.